Welcome to Behind the Pay Stub, the show where we tackle the big questions shaping our schools, classrooms, and communities. My name is Mariana, and I will be your host. Growing up, I've always wanted to be a teacher. I've always loved the idea of teaching children, and I continue to believe in the power of education to transform lives and shape the future. I've always wanted to make a difference in the lives of people around me, and younger me thought, what better job than being a teacher? Did I know how much the average teacher gets paid? Did I realize how underappreciated teachers are within our country? The answer to all these questions is no. And that is why today's conversation is so important. Today, we're diving into a heated and essential conversation. Is it time to radically rethink teacher professionalization and teacher pay? We're living in a moment where public education is facing mounting pressures, staff shortages, burnout, declining enrollment in teacher prep programs, and a profession that many feel has lost its status. On one side of the debate, we have calls for increased teaching compensation and stronger professional autonomy, inspired by arguments like those found in Chapter 11 of A Search for Common Ground by Rick Hess and Pedro Noguera. Hess argues for a differentiated pay and incentives to attract top talent, while Noguera pushes back, highlighting the structural issues and inequities that salary alone can't solve. At the same time, in Taking Back Teaching, Carl, Jones Lehman, and Quinn call for a transformation of the profession, not just better pay, but a reimaging of teachers as intellectuals and change agents in their communities. And as we heard in Have You Heard, episode 149, The Rise and Fall of the Teaching Profession, the challenges facing educators today are as much as about respect and autonomy as they are about wages. So today we ask, how do we uplift and reprofessionalize teaching in a way that values both the labor and the leadership of educators? Is better pay enough, or is there more at stake in the fight for the future of the profession? Let's meet
All
our
right,
debaters.
hello. My name is Ado Okechukwu. I'm a previous high school educator who taught health and science to 11th and 12th grade students in South Philly. I recently left my role in academia due to finances. To be fully transparent, I was making $45,000 a year, and after taxes, my pay stubs measured around $1,300 bi-weekly. The amount of time and work and devotion that I put into my role did not nearly equate to my full on earning potential. As an educator, I felt as if I was working all night and day, answering emails from students while I was out with my friends, creating lesson plans from scratch over my free time on the weekends, and staying after school every week due to professional development trainings. And to tell you the truth, I was burnt out and did not know how much longer I could take in this role. Therefore, the shortcomings I felt from my role as a teacher did not stem from the students, but it stemmed from the system. As a Black educator, my experience was not unique. Not only are teachers already given limited resources, but the gap deepened for Black educators. On my last day of school, one of my Black students came up to me and said, "They always do this to us, Miss O." These words continuously ring through my ears on a daily basis. I interpreted this as they do not support students or teachers of color in any space, which causes such low retention rates for Black educators and even low retention rates for student engagement for Black students across the board. Let me paint a picture for the audience that aids in breaking the fourth wall. A teacher wears many hats. They can be a social worker when conflicts arise, a coach when it comes to pushing and motivating their students on a daily basis, a therapist when it comes to dealing with conflict resolution, and ultimately being a teacher. This role encompasses of every job title you can think of in society. Therefore, the burden for Black educators tends to be even heavier. We are more likely to teach in underfunded schools in urban areas that are already given minimal resources. Several times in my experience as an educator, I had to buy my classroom supplies, whether it be stickers, classroom decor, or even pens and paper. As an educator, we ultimately do things because we know it's a right thing to do. But if it's not the right thing for us, is it even the right thing at all? As teachers, at times, we don't even realize how we are abused by the system. We are not respected at all, and that's a fact. I remember when individuals asked what I did for my career, and I told them I was a teacher. They instantly cringed and said, "Oh no, are you sure that's what you want to do with your life?" The conversation surrounding teaching runs so deep that we can create a whole new episode of this pod. That just primarily focuses on respectability politics in educational systems, but that is a different topic for a different time.
Thank you, Ada. It is great to have you here with us today. I really appreciate hearing your story. You are heard. I feel like many teachers feel like they are burnt out and underpaid, and I'm glad we are having this conversation today. I'm excited to hear about what you and Craig have to say about our main questions. How do we uplift and reprofessionalize teaching in a way that values both the labor and the leadership of educators? And is better pay enough, or is there more at stake in the fight for the future of the profession? Now let's hear from Craig.
My name is Craig Randall, and I'm a first year teacher at a behavior school in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Like most teachers, I entered this profession because I believed I could make a difference. I wanted to foster a space where I could build trust with kids who have otherwise been neglected and even outright oppressed by various power systems. But even after less than a year, I got to be honest in saying I'm already feeling burnt out. And not the kind of feeling that a spring break can fix. I'm feeling such a level of tiredness and friction that I begin to seriously question if the work I'm doing is sustainable for me. Because of that, I think it's time to have an honest conversation about teacher pay and how it is structured. Namely, I think that merit-based pay could reduce many of the problems of burnout that many teachers like myself and Ada experience.
That I think so many educators feel, but don't always say it loud. That deep, bone deep exhaustion that doesn't just come from long days, but from constantly trying to fight systems that feel immovable. I also appreciate the vulnerability in naming both your hope and your fatigue. It sets the tone for an honest and layered conversation. Your point about merit based pay is a bold one, and it taps into a much bigger question about how we define merit in teaching and who gets to decide what effective teaching looks like. With this, we're going to hear back from Ada, and then have a conversation about your point of view when it comes to what merit looks like in your context and how we ensure it is measured in a way that is equitable, especially for teachers working in the most challenging settings. I want to turn to you now, Ada. In some of our past discussions, we've brought in powerful frameworks to help us understand how teacher pay is deeply tied to how society views the roles of educators. Can you help us unpack that a bit more? Specifically, how do the tensions between seeing teachers as professionals versus civil servants shape this issue? And what are the broader consequences when teachers aren't paid fairly?
Yes, thank you so much, Mariana, for that transition. In A Search for a Common Ground by Heston Noguera, the readings wrestle with the tensions between treating teachers like full professionals, like doctors, lawyers, engineers, or just civil servants. And if we add David Labourie's framework, the purpose of education stems from how systemic issues pan out in society. So I mapped out 3 bullet points that will give us a further understanding of what this curtails. Social mobility frameworks frames education as a pathway to a better life. Like, look at us now. We're in graduate programs. We've went to K to 12 education because we were conditioned at such a young age that we need to advance ourselves in academia in order to become civil servants or in order to become higher in society. All of that is conditioning that was stemmed into us as a youth. Social efficiency states that teachers are also workforce builders. Teachers frame the next building of society. We frame the children in society on how they're going to progress. When teachers are not paid, all of the 3 purposes stated previously instantly get compromised. Therefore, you cannot build upward mobility without a firm and stable foundation. Nonetheless, as an educator, it occurred to me that the teacher wage gap was and is significant reason why teacher retention rates are significantly low. In summary, as a society, we cannot build upward mobility if our educators are not being fairly compensated. Let's be clear, educators are overworked and underpaid, and this is what we hear time and time and again. In the presented readings by Hess and Noguera, they stated that society has issues when it comes to differentiating teachers from their role as professionals and or civil servants. Labour's theory, as mentioned in the readings, presented that teaching is not just plain instruction, it's a cultural principle. This theory ultimately mentions that institutions that underpay and undervalue teachers are not doing this accidentally, but they are conforming to structural norms that need to be changed and challenged. To transition, let's discuss the broken contract at the heart of the issue. Through the readings, I learned that teaching is more than just instruction. It encompasses of cultural competency, emotional labor, counseling, and more that follows. Hess and Noguera mentioned in Chapter 11 of Search for a Common Ground that the ambiguity surrounding the role of an educator brings light to the respect that individuals in society give to teachers overall. This concept feeds into the fact that teachers do so much for so little. I've heard from teachers in the past who stated that the paid summer breaks were not even enough to recoup from the stress and devotion that they put into their everyday work lives. To be transparent, I've told people in the past that teaching is not worth it, especially as a Black educator. We are equally disparaged as Black students.
Thank you, Ada. You've given us a lot to think about. Your point about how teacher compensation, or the lack of it, reflects deeper societal values, really bringing Lavery's framework to life. If we say education is the key to social mobility, workforce development, and democracy, but we continue to overpay and undervalue the people at the heart of the system, then we're contradicting ourselves at every level. I also really appreciate how you surface the emotional and cultural labor teachers carry, work that often goes unrecognized, especially for Black educators and educators of color. Craig, I want to bring you back in here. You mentioned earlier that you support merit-based pay, which some might say is a more performance-driven, even corporate approach. How do you see merit pay addressing, or maybe even challenging, the structural inequities Ada just laid out? And how do we ensure it doesn't end up reinforcing the same systems we're trying to dismantle?
Thanks, Mariana. And thank you too, Ada. A lot of what you said has resonated with my experience. In my job, I've already felt the emotional weight involved in being a teacher. You're not just teaching and instructing, you're also managing trauma, handling crises, and doing all of it under intense pressure. I also see how that emotional labor often goes underappreciated, especially for Black and Brown educators. However, I think part of the reason this work goes unnoticed is because we treat all teaching as equal hours on the clock, no matter how much energy or innovation a teacher puts into the job. Merit pay isn't a corporate structure, but rather a way to reward the hardest working teachers, many of whom serve students of color. In a search for common ground, Hess points out that teachers are often treated like civil servants instead of specialized professionals, which you were bringing up earlier, Ada. The way our pay is structured right now doesn't reflect the differences in what teachers actually do. A teacher who coasts through the day and just hands out worksheets gets paid the same as a teacher who is constantly trying to innovate their methods and build strong relationships with students. Merit pay shouldn't just be built around test scores, because all that does is rank someone's ability to teach a test. Instead, it should be based on fostering strong emotional, cultural, and community bonds that Taking Back Teaching describes, such as restorative justice, culturally responsive education, and working in the community. Right now, that work isn't acknowledged or materially encouraged by the pay system. Some may say that merit pay reinforces bias. While there may be some truth in that, I think that the answer is to design it rather than to just scrap the idea entirely. If factors such as peer evaluations, student input, and clear rubrics on expectations were used, a non-corporate merit pay could be implemented. This form of merit pay could actually help teachers of color more, since it accounts for things that Black educators have already been doing, like reaching out to family members and teaching kids about systems of oppression that just doesn't happen as much in white suburban schools. Lavery's framework that Ada mentioned says the purpose of education may be social mobility, efficiency, democracy, or some combination of the three. Ada also correctly pointed out that none of these are possible without a stable teaching force. The thing is, our current pay structure doesn't support those goals either. It doesn't keep the most driven teachers in the field, and it doesn't reward leadership. The current structure doesn't make teaching an attractive field for millions of brilliant and inspired young people. To do that, we need a system that increases teacher pay across the board, but that also incentivizes and financially rewards teachers that go above and beyond for their students.
Thanks, Craig. I hear you. Ada, earlier you highlighted the systemic contradictions in how we value educators, particularly through the lens of Lavery's framework. Lavery discusses the three competing goals of public education. One, democratic equality, two, social efficiency, and three, social mobility, and how these goals often conflict, leading to tensions in educational policy and practice. You also mentioned the emotional labor that teachers, especially women and teachers of color, invest in their work, which often goes unrecognized and uncompensated. This aligns with the discussions in educational literature about how the undervaluation of teachers' holistic contributions to student development. Given these perspectives, could you elaborate on how these systemic issues influence teacher compensation and retention, and what policy measures you believe could address these challenges?
Thank you so much, Mariana and Craig, for your wonderful corresponding points. All right, so what I want to do first is to dive into policy. From Labour's framework and similar to what Craig stated previously, on the conflicting purposes of education aids in making sense of the systemic contradiction. In the readings, Labour states how we can support students to participate in a democracy if their teachers cannot afford to live in one. Logistically, the best way to quell wage gap for teachers in educational spaces can stem from creating fair and equitable spaces for teachers overall across the board. From my understanding, it seems as if individuals run away from becoming teachers due to the low wages. It is unfortunate, but it seems as if to be a teacher in this present framework, it is almost as if it has to be a privilege. As someone who is an opponent of merit-based pay, I believe that the ideology that surrounds this theory does not thoroughly aid in capturing the emotional labor that teachers pour into their everyday work and lives. In the podcast by Quinn Jones, Lehman, and Carl, they mention how educators are underserved and undervalued, which inherently causes an emotional toll, specifically for women educators and teachers of color. In summary, we do not have metrics for empathy. My call to action is as educators, we should not let systems gaslight us into believing that we are not worth being compensated. Let's view teachers as professionals and not placeholders.
Thank you, Ada. I feel like you hit home for a lot of educators and a lot of our people who are listening to this conversation right now. Now that we have finished part one, let's hop into part two, where we talk about merit pay. Craig, earlier you mentioned your support for merit-based pay as a means to recognize the multifaceted roles teachers play. In Taking Back Teaching, Carl Quinn and Jones Lehman discuss the concept of teachers as community leaders and intellectuals, emphasizing the need for systemic changes to honor this role. Given this framing, how do you envision merit-based pay systems that genuinely acknowledge and compensate the comprehensive contributions of educators, especially considering the additional responsibilities often shouldered by Black teachers and other educators of color?
That's a great question, Mariana. And while I agree with the framing of teachers as community leaders and intellectuals, the fact is that we don't pay people who do this work like they're as important to our communities as they actually are. We can't just tell people it's a hard profession or at least you get the summers off while completely ignoring that these facts don't stop people from seeking careers elsewhere. If we're serious about reimagining teaching, we need to build the pay systems that reward the people actually doing that important work you mentioned. What Anna said about the system hitting Black educators harder is absolutely true, and I've seen it firsthand. They're expected to be responsible for behaviors of students of color because they, quote unquote, share the same cultural understanding. Meanwhile, they tend to work in school districts that are underfunded. However, I do think that merit pay, if done in an equitable manner, like I mentioned earlier, it could actually value that underappreciated emotional labor with real material benefits rather than kind but ultimately meaningless words and gestures that we see now.
Thank you, Craig. I really do appreciate the fact that you said that we don't pay people who do this work like they're as important to our communities, especially in the roles that teachers play in children's lives, in parents' lives, in anyone who's in the school system's lives. I really appreciate you hearing what Ada has to say about hitting Black educators hard. I completely agree with the both of you, but I'm still curious about what Ada has to say about the work of Carl, Jones Lehman, and Quinn's 2010 Taking Back Teaching. Ada, did anything hit home for you in this reading? Do you disagree or agree with what Craig is telling us?
Yes, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, Mariana and Craig. So to give a deeper understanding, I think it's important for us to create a safe and deeper space for educators as a whole. Craig brought up a powerful point when it comes to systemic barriers that impact Black educators. One of the most integral parts of this conversation that came to mind is that intense emotional labor goes extremely unnoticed in the profession of teaching. What resonated for me from this discussion is that it's not just about instruction, but about building advocacy for students and teachers. Like how I always say and how I always state, we should not be pushing self-advocacy measures on Black educators and students, but we should have systems that are built in place to instantly advocate for Black students and educators abroad.
Thanks, Ada. I really, really hear what you are saying. Craig, do you have any last points on merit pay you want to touch on before we hop into our next segment?
Absolutely. So look, I know that people worry that pay could just become another way to divide our teachers. But the fact is that what we have now just isn't working. Teachers are leaving and fewer people are going into the profession. Those that stay feel stuck, unappreciated, and burnt out. If we want to keep our best educators, especially in high need schools, we have to give them more than just vague gestures of appreciation. We need to give them real support in the form of merit pay so that they don't have to worry about making ends meet in addition to an already difficult job. Of course, this isn't a magic fix for wider structural problems. Base pay needs to rise for all staff and faculty. We also need job protections, fair contracts, and a more equitable system of funding. But we need flexibility, creativity, and a culture of excellence, not just compliance and coasting. These two things aren't mutually exclusive. Some falsely say that either you support all teachers or you support merit pay, but the truth is that both are possible. We can raise the base of what teachers receive while also allowing for much higher potential levels of pay for those who truly show excellence. We need to build a system that not only supports its teachers for the incredibly demanding work they do, but that also allows them to take risks, embrace leadership potential, and receive truly generous compensation.
Thank you, Craig, for your thoughtful insights. Your emphasis on the necessity of both a strong base salary and equitable merit-based pay highlights the multifaceted challenges in teacher compensation. As you pointed out, while merit pay can recognize exceptional contributions, it's crucial that such systems are designed to be inclusive and reflective of the diverse roles teachers play, especially those often shouldered by educators of color. Research indicates that Black teachers frequently undertake additional responsibilities such as culture mentorship and community engagement, which are vital yet often get yet often go unacknowledged into traditional evaluation systems. Moreover, studies have shown that Black teachers are less likely to participate in bonus programs tied to evaluations, often due to concerns about the fairness and comprehensiveness of these assessments. This underscores the importance of developing evaluation and compensation systems that are equitable and recognize the full scope of teachers' contributions. Incorporating frameworks like those discussed in Taking Back Teaching by Carl Quinn and Jones Lehman, which advocate for viewing teachers as community leaders and intellectuals, can guide the development of more holistic evaluation criteria, such as such an approach ensures that compensation systems not only reward measurable outcomes, but also the invaluable, though less quantifiable aspects of teaching. Now that we have heard all opinions on merit-based pay, we are going to close out our talk with a Q&A section based from the podcast, Have You Heard, number 149, The Rise and Fall of the Teaching Profession. Okay, guys, we are hopping into section 3 of our podcast, which is a Q&A of Have You Heard? Number 149, The Rise and Fall of Teaching Profession. Once again, I'm your host, Mariana, and in this segment, we're diving into the question, has the teaching profession fallen or is it simply transforming? Inspired by the podcast, Have You Heard? We are back with your two guests, Ada and Craig, who bring two strong but differing views. Let's begin with the big picture. The episode opens by tracing a 50-year arc of decline in the teaching profession, especially following the 1983 A Nation at Risk report. Ada, the podcast frames this moment as a fall. Do you agree with that framing?
Absolutely. A Nation at Risk marked the beginning of a dangerous narrative that public schools were failing and teachers were to blame. As Jack Snyder and Jennifer Berkshire discussed in the episode, this ushered in decades of teacher-proof reforms that stripped teachers of agency and embedded mistrust into policy. Teaching became more about compliance than creativity. That's a fall, not just a shift.
I completely agree. That historical framing really sets the tone. How decades of reform built a narrative of distrust. Craig, what's your take? Do you see this as a fall or something else?
I don't deny the pressures, but I think the profession is evolving. Jennifer Berkshire also mentions how teaching is being reimagined in certain spaces, like through community schools and teacher-led models. We're seeing educators step into leadership roles, not just survive, but reshape their environments.
Interesting contrast. So we have a long view warning of decline on one hand and a more optimistic reading of transformation on the other. Let's explore how policies shape this moment. For question 2, the podcast critiques corporate style reforms, particularly teacher evaluations tied to student test scores and the rise of charter schools. Ada, how do these policies connect to what you describe as the profession's decline?
These reforms were devastating. The episode highlights how teachers in cities like Chicago and Denver were reduced to numbers, their job security hinging on test data that didn't reflect their full impact. That's demoralizing. Teaching became delivery of standards and not relationship building or intellectual work.
Yes, that line from the podcast, teaching as a delivery mechanism, really struck me too. It paints a vivid picture of what's been lost. Craig, do you see these reforms differently?
To some extent, I agree that they were often misguided, but I also think they forced districts to look at disparities more seriously. Jennifer and Jack talk about how the reforms at least created space to confront inequities, even if the solutions weren't always effective. So the question is, how do we preserve accountability without deprofessionalizing the role?
A nonce take. So we're talking about good intentions with harmful implementation, a common thread in education reform. Let's turn now to resistance. For question 3, the episode also highlights the wave of teacher strikes in places like West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona, not just over pay, but for dignity and respect. Ada, how do you interpret this wave of activism?
Thank you for your post question, Mariana. It's both a symptom and a solution. The podcast makes clear that these strikes were about reclaiming the profession. Teachers demanded more than a raise. They wanted to be seen as experts, as public servants, and not liabilities. That's incredibly powerful. It's a response to years of being blamed for systemic failure.
Yes, Jack Snyder even calls it, quote unquote, a resurrection of teacher voice. Craig, do you share that sense of hope?
I do, to an extent. The strikes energize the field, but we need to move from resistance to redesign. As the podcast points out, we can't just protest. We need to build alternative models like what's happening in community-centered schools or union-led professional development.
Absolutely. The activism is inspiring, but what follows matters just as much. So let's talk about where we go from here. Looking ahead, what gives you hope or concern about the future of the teaching profession?
Well, thank you, Mariana. I'm hopeful because, as Jennifer Berkshire says, teachers are organizing at the grassroots level, often in coalition with parents and communities. That's a major shift. But I am worried. I'm worried about what significant structural change, like livable wages and less punitive accountability, will continue to hemorrhage talent.
So the foundation is there, but it needs real investment. Craig?
I'm hopeful too. And, I'm a younger teacher, and, a lot of younger teachers are bringing new energy, especially around culturally responsive teaching and racial equity. Jack Schneider points out the growing awareness that teaching is political, and many educators are leaning into that rather than avoiding it. If we support that shift, we can actually build a stronger profession, one that reflects our communities.
Craig, that's such a crucial point. Supporting rather than braining new educators. If we want teaching to be sustainable, it has to be human centered. Thank you both for such an honest, grounded discussion. Whether you see the profession as falling, rising, or both, one thing is clear: the stakes could not be higher. To our listeners, what do you think? Is teaching in crisis, or are we witnessing a new beginning? Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and stay in the conversation. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Behind the Pay Stub. Today's conversation revealed just how layered and urgent the issue of teacher pay and professionalization really is. What started as a childhood dream for many, mine included, has become a daily struggle for recognition, sustainability, and justice within one of the most essential professions in our society. We heard powerful arguments for rethinking how we value teachers, not just through a paycheck, but through the roles we expect them to play as counselors, community leaders, intellectuals, and advocates. As Have You Heard reminded us, the teaching profession has been eroded not just by low wages, but by a lack of respect, agency, and support. And as Hess and O'Gara debate, the solutions are complex, ranging from differentiated pay to confronting the deeper inequities embedded in our systems. Ultimately, this is not just a conversation about dollars, it's about dignity. It's about whether we as a society are ready to back up our praise for teachers with the policies and structures that truly honor our work. So, whether you're a future educator, a student, a policymaker, or someone who just simply believes in the power of education, I hope this episode pushed your thinking. Because if we want to build a future where all children thrive, we must start by investing in the people who teach them, not just with better pay, but with respect, voice, and support they deserve. Again, until next time, I'm Mariana, and this was Behind the Pay Stub. Keep questioning, keep reflecting, and most importantly, keep showing up for yourself, for your students, and for your communities.